Hello, I'm Neil Dealey, co-founder and partner of Architects and Urban Planners Metropolitan Workshop. Welcome to Reshaped, a podcast series to mark our 15th year and to record perspectives on how the built environment is changing and needs to change in this historic moment. We asked leading thinkers and doers to respond to issues highlighted by the pandemic while we're in the throes of change, and memories and perspectives are fresh. Has the door opened to a new era? We think so. The pandemic has revealed fundamental housing inequalities in Ireland, but temporary moratoria such as banning evictions and prohibiting short-term lets are perhaps hiding the precarious state some people are living in. And when these temporary measures end, some may fall over the edge and homelessness increase, our speaker in this episode thinks. The pandemic has added urgency to meeting these needs, particularly in Dublin. And despite Ireland being one of Europe's most prolific creators of social housing in the post-war years, when it built 22% of all housing stock, this has now shrunk to around 8%, with predictable consequences. The breadth of discussion around housing policy needs to change if Ireland's housing crisis is to be addressed effectively, she argues. She is Michelle Norris, Professor of Social Policy, University College Dublin. She is also Chair of the Housing Finance Agency and a board member of the Land Development Agency.
The COVID emergency has had really profound implications for all aspects of housing in Ireland and around the world, and has forced individuals, governments and the construction industry to think more about housing and reconsider long-held views about its importance and its provision. At an individual level, the pandemic has forced many of us to spend a lot more time in our homes. We've come to appreciate the good points of our homes, and if we weren't happy with them, to resent their shortcomings more than ever, and perhaps even move home or think seriously about doing so. It's had enormous impact on the housing market and the construction industry. It has brought house building to a halt in many countries and put construction workers out of work. The effects of the COVID emergency are likely to be felt in the construction industry long after the pandemic ends. The Irish government and many other governments have banned evictions of private renting tenants during the pandemic. They've frozen rents and in some cases also prohibited short-term letting of housing on platforms like Airbnb. However, the pandemic has had the most significant impact on the housing of low-income households and others who can't access adequate housing. Higher outbreaks of COVID-19 among disadvantaged households, many of whom are ethnic minority, migrant or traveller background, are strongly related to poor living conditions, to overcrowding, multi-generational living, different households sharing accommodation, and poor neighbourhood quality, particularly limited outdoor space. As well as accentuating these housing inequalities, the pandemic has also starkly revealed their extent. In Ireland, we've seen a welcome decline in the number of people who are homeless following the moratorium on evictions of private renting tenants introduced at the start of the pandemic. But this has revealed just how precarious the housing situation of some of our fellow citizens is. Many people clearly live their lives teetering on the brink of homelessness. And when the moratorium is lifted, they may fall over the edge. So the pandemic should add urgency to ongoing efforts to better meet the housing needs of low-income households, particularly in Dublin, where the homelessness problem is most acute. The private rented sector, supported by housing allowances like housing assistance payment, simply can't supply enough housing for low-income households. And the loss of a tenancy in the private rented sector and failure to secure another one is the main driver of the radical rise in homelessness, which we've seen in Ireland in recent years. However, I'd like to suggest that we need to broaden the focus of our discussions regarding social housing's contribution to solving the housing crisis. To date, these have focused almost entirely on how we can provide more social housing, and there's been very little analysis of what we do with it when we have it. I think that unless we start to think more about the latter, we won't make meaningful inroads into solving our shortage of affordable accommodation. And indeed, the benefits of a substantial proportion of the €2 billion per annum, which the Irish government is currently spending on social housing, will be lost. It is not widely appreciated in Ireland that the level of social housing provided historically in this country is amongst the highest in the world. 22% of the housing stock in Ireland was originally built as social housing, mainly by local authorities. So the total level of social housing provision here matches that of countries such as Austria, Denmark, and France, where the sector is currently amongst the largest in the world. However, in contrast to these countries, only 8.9% of housing in Ireland is currently social housing. The difference between the 22% of the housing stock that was built as social housing and the 8.9%, which is currently let as social housing, reflects a level of privatisation in Ireland via sales to tenants, which is among the highest in Western Europe. We in Ireland started selling social housing to tenants in 1936, and many individuals have benefited from this policy, including my own extended family. It has enabled an enormous transfer of wealth to lower income households because the dwellings were sold at a large discount from market value. However, while the individual benefits are substantial, so are the collective costs. This system means that, unlike in Copenhagen, for instance, where investment in social housing made during the 1950s is still providing social housing today, in Dublin, the investment made by our forebears in the 1950s has been lost to the social housing system through privatisation, and we are forced to reinvest to provide new social housing at 2021 prices. In addition to these long-standing drains on social housing investment, in recent years we've added some new measures which have facilitated further losses of the benefits of this spending. One of these has received widespread public support, and this is the use of public-private partnerships and leasing arrangements to provide social housing. Although some evaluations have found these measures constitute good value for money, the conclusions reached are heavily skewed by the assumptions used in the assessment model. I believe that these measures are poor value for money, but a greater concern is that they mean that the value of social housing investment made this year is not retained in the system. And so in future, we need to go back and reinvest again. A further drain on social housing investment, which has emerged in recent years and is not widely understood, but has the potential to be very significant, relates to housing association provided social housing. This sector was traditionally small in Ireland, but has grown significantly since 1990, and in recent years has provided approximately half of social housing output. The provision of this housing is funded primarily by government loans, and the repayment of these loans is also funded mainly by government subsidies. However, when these loans are repaid, housing associations are not under any obligation to continue to let the dwellings as social housing and therefore to charge below market rents. As non-profit bodies, housing associations can't pay dividends to shareholders, but they can let dwellings at market rent and require the state to subsidise the dwellings a second time through housing assistance payment. There is a lot of public concern in Ireland about providing more affordable housing, and in particular about how to reduce homelessness, which is currently at historic highs. There's been widespread discussion here about how other countries have managed to do this. Dublin City Council ran a very well-attended exhibition on the social housing sector in Vienna in recent years, for instance. However, it is not widely understood that the key differences between Dublin and Vienna relates not to the levels of public investment made in providing social housing, but rather to whether the value of this investment has been retained in the social housing sector or not, and whether this investment's been used for the collective long-term good, or whether it's been drained from the system and its benefits lost to future generations. A senior civil servant once told me that providing social housing in Ireland is like trying to fill a bucket which has a hole in the end of it. And I think we need to focus on filling the hole if we're ever going to be successful in refilling the bucket.
That was Professor Michelle Norris. The difference between Ireland's post-war provision of social housing and the situation today is all too stark. especially when compared to that of other EU member countries with which Ireland likes to compare itself. Equally stark is the need for a rethink in housing policies. The way to do it, Michelle argues, is to devise new or adjust existing policies to ensure social housing investment is retained within the system, not to let it drain into the private sector or indeed into the public sector housing providers, which means future generations will be forced once again to dip into their pockets to replace that investment. There is much public concern and discussion about these issues and widespread envy of how other countries have managed to tackle the problem, she reports. The hole in Ireland's social housing bucket needs fixing. You can listen to other podcasts in the Reshape series at all the major providers, or go to our website, metwork.co.uk. Series directed by Lee Mallet, produced by David Michon and Justina Green, recorded and edited by Sean Crook.